Well, hello and welcome to Genesis chapter 20. This is an important chapter in the story of Abraham and Sarah because it brings together a number of the themes that have been prevalent throughout chapters 12 through to chapter 20 and repeats a number of them so we can see a better explanation of the past and why Abraham and Sarah did the things they did, and also a better explanation about how God acts through Abraham and Sarah and why. And we're going to look at those two of the themes that God exposes in this particular chapter of Genesis, so we get a better picture of both Abraham and himself, our God, and why he does the things he does. And the two themes are guilt. How do we deal with guilt? How does Abraham and Abimelech deal with guilt? And God, how does he respond to the guilt of both characters? And second theme is the plan of God. How does God work with people who are guilty of the sins and the consequences that flow from that? So guilt and God's plans. So read the text as it comes up on the screen or follow along with it, and then we'll come back to the text together in Genesis 20 and pick out a few things that we can also apply into our own lives. Genesis 20, beginning at the first verse, and we're reading the entire chapter together. Genesis 20, verse 1. Now Abraham moved on from there into the region of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said to his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman." Now Abimelech had not gone near her. So he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister,' and didn't she also say, 'He is my brother'? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands." Then God said to him in the dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. That is why I did not let you touch her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all who belong to you will die." Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, "What have you done to us? How have I wronged you, that you have brought such guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done." And Abimelech asked Abraham, "What was your reason for doing this?" Abraham replied, "I said to myself, 'This is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's house, I said to her, "This is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, 'He is my brother.'" Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, "My land is before you, live wherever you like." To Sarah he said, "I am giving you your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offence against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female slaves, so they could have children again. For the Lord had kept all the women in Abimelech's household from conceiving because of Abraham's wife Sarah. If you've been following along from Genesis 12 onwards, you would notice the same themes that have cropped up in the past have re-engaged here. And it does speak to us, I think, immediately, because I see myself, and you may see yourself, in both Abraham and Sarah. And that is that because we are fearful, or because our fears aren't at rest within us, we haven't overcome them, we may come back into circumstances where again they rise up, and we end up repeating the same sinful behaviours that we knew were wrong once again. And the reason is not because we wish to engage in the same circumstances. I'm sure Abraham didn't want to punt his wife off, and I'm sure Sarah hated the idea that she would be removed from Abraham's family into such disastrous situation once again. That was not her wish. She was innocent of such a charge, but Abraham was not. He was guilty. So why did he do it? He tells us. Abraham replied, "I said to myself, 'This is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife.'" So he made a judgment about the faithfulness to God of others and about their morality, and he made that decision to palm his wife off because of his own fears. And God reminds him here in this story that he was wrong. We already had one Gentile unbeliever who demonstrated great faith earlier in Melchizedek, and now here we have another in Abimelech. We have a righteous king and an unrighteous Abraham. Abraham demonstrated that it wasn't Abimelech he was afraid of, it was his own fears that got the better of him. And he even tells us so in the next verse. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my mother, though not of my daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her. So Abraham had hatched this plan long ago. Firstly, he blames God almost. You can almost hear Genesis 3 here. When God had me wander, how passive is that? When God forced me or God encouraged me to do this, then the only consequence that I could have in order to be safe was to tell others that Sarah's my wife to tell Sarah's my sister in order that I may be safe. In other words, he would rather tell a lie than trust in God. Sounds like a lot of us. In other words, Abraham is just like you and me. When push comes to shove, it is the unresolved fears that help our life go forward. Unresolved fears push you in a direction that you do not want to go because you have not brought those fears to God. You have not asked him to resolve them. Even though he had a chance to do that way back in Genesis 12, but we all know it takes us a little longer to learn than we would like otherwise. And Abraham, sadly, is no different to the rest of us. The king here, Abimelech, he is a righteous man. He does the right thing. He hears the revelation of God. He responds, and he goes over and above in making sure that he himself is absolved of guilt. And so Abraham is left as the guilty party here. Sarah is innocent. Abimelech is innocent. Abraham is not. But yet God still uses Abraham to demonstrate his plans. God had told Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. You're going to bless many. And we get an evidence of it right here. Abraham intercedes for the Philistines, intercedes for the people of Gerar, and that fulfills the promise of God. But not because Abraham is righteous, but because God's plans are righteous. He can use sinful people in his plans. God is an amazing God. I don't need to be perfect. Now, not to say that my lack of perfection demonstrated in my sin has no consequences. Of course it does. And God doesn't bless sin, but God can use sinful people for amazing purposes. And that can be true for you and me. When we are caught in sin, he wants us to repent. He doesn't absolve Abraham of guilt here. It's obvious Abraham is the guilty party. But in his sin, God can still use him. It says here for the first time that Abraham is a prophet, and he intercedes for Abimelech. He actually brings healing to that group of people that they didn't have before, and he opens up the wounds that were shut, in this case, during the time of God's judgment upon Abimelech and his family and nation. God used the plans that he had through Abraham to demonstrate to us as well that God's plans never fail, and that the promise he made to Abraham to be a blessing to the nations is starting to come true. Initially, even though Abraham is guilty for the sins of his own life. Maybe like you and me. God can use us irrespective of our goodness for his plans. He would love to use us by us following in his plans, because we get to rejoice in both the blessing and the consequences. Abraham, he got to, if you like, be a part of the blessing, but sadly those initial consequences were altogether wrong for him and he missed out. But God demonstrated his own love for him in upholding God's promises to Abraham, and he can do the same for us. It may involve you being brought before him in guilt and having you confess those sins before he uses you, or he may use your sinfulness to demonstrate God's great amazing pleasure in showing you his plan. It had nothing to do with your sin being good. God is just bigger than that. Abraham continues on. Abimelech continues on. Sarah continues on. And hopefully in the weeks to come they'll continue on in greater blessing, because they start to learn from God's teaching of them. So as we end, Have you learnt from your past sins in order to not repeat them? The sign that you would have learned is the fear that drove you, the unholy desires that drove you to that sin. Have you learnt from them, and have you repented of them? Because if not, you may repeat the same sins of Abraham. If so, then hopefully, like Abraham, you can learn from your mistakes and not repeat them. And we'll see that in amazing detail in the coming passages in Genesis 21 and 22. Amen.